Well, good evening and happy first Sunday of Lent to our viewers. Welcome to Patristicast. This is the 24th episode of Scholars Forum, and I am very delighted to have on here Dr. Paul Blowers, who is Dean E. Walker Professor of Church History at Emmanuel Christian Seminary at Milligan University, out in the beautiful Smoky Mountains area of Eastern Tennessee. Dr. Blowers, welcome to Patristicast.
Thanks, John. Great to be aboard.
You have authored many books, co-edited many books. Tonight, we are going to talk about your recent book, see if I can get an angle where people can see it.
Yeah.
Visions and Faces of the Tragic, the mimesis of tragedy and the folly of salvation in early Christian literature. I suppose there's no better place to start this conversation than just asking you, where did you get the idea for this book?
Well, if you open the beginning of it and read the preface, I've had an interest in the theater for years. One of my best friends, to whom the book is dedicated, is a longtime friend, and he's the director was just retired as director of theater at Milligan. In our undergraduate program, and I was in a number of productions there, and one of my favorites, which I mentioned there in the preface, was Hamlet, which is of course a classic Shakespearean tragedy. But he and I, over the years, talked a lot about dramatic theory, and of course he's much more the artist who has directed. He's done professional acting work himself. He's a very accomplished artist, but we've always talked about issues of the relationship between theater and reality, and the whole notion of mimesis, and the ways in which theater is trying to both communicate and reshape reality, and those kinds of questions. And so I've always had sort of a lingering interest in dramatic theory. And one of my favorite readings, one of the favorite people that I read in recent years is Hans Urs von Balthasar, and particularly his series in his trilogy, the middle series, which is the Theodramatics series, where he is engaging heavily with early Christian sources, and to some degree then brings to light some of the themes that I talk about in the book, although he's not doing what I was really interested in doing, and that is really exploring in some depth the ways in which early Christian writers and preachers are engaging the traditions of Greco-Roman drama, and particularly tragedy, and reworking them. And of course, also then finding elements within the Bible, narrative elements within the Bible that interestingly interface with tragic traditions, even though, of course, all the while those writers were fiercely critical of the tragedians, the ancient tragedians, because, for theological and even philosophical reasons. But they couldn't compete with the impact of drama and the pervasiveness of it in virtually every ancient culture, or for that matter, every culture.
Yes.
And the ways in which, at the end of the day, tragedy, even though Plato tried to argue otherwise, tragedy was a very important element in the philosophical tradition, and asked a lot of questions that were forced on the philosophers to deal with. And even Plato kind of conceded that, So that's kind of how I got interested in it. I had always been interested in the patristic notion of the divine economy, which was I did a book in 2012 called The Drama of the Divine Economy on early Christian understanding of creation cosmology, excuse my dog back here drinking water. Stop, Henry. Stop. Um, but I did that book with a real interest in conveying how the very and of divine engagement with the cosmos and the providential element within early Christian understandings of creation were presented in ways that defied purely philosophical exposition, that were always engaging with mythos and not just with logos. And I always liked Rowan Williams' point that he made years ago that in many respects, while early Christian writers were trying to theologize on and give exposition philosophically and theologically to biblical narrative, one of the other things that they're doing is sort of re-mythologizing scripture, retelling the story in fresh ways. And of course, some early Christian writers more than others engaged with the poetic and theatrical traditions of the Greeks and Romans, and I try to point that out in the book. But generally, it just puts I think this what I would borrow from von Balthasar, this sort of theodramatic view of reality, I think is very much grounded in a number of patristic writers. Of course, in this book, I favor more the 4th century folks. I do some work in pre-Nicene writers, but I do a lot of work on the Cappadocians and Augustine and Chrysostom. So.
Yeah, and you make it a point to, there's a reason for that. It's not just some personal preference. You say there's a reason for that in your book, and we're gonna get to that. But there's you were very clear about the premise of the book. So I thought I would read that little statement about the passage where you discuss your premise. And I think that'd be a good starting point to get into the contents of the book. And I'm glad you brought up Plato, because we're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle too a little bit.
Yeah.
We always have to talk about them.
Absolutely.
We always have. So this is on page 3. My premise for this book is that the makings of tragical interpretation of human existence are sometimes overt, but also frequently latent, implicit, or oblique in patristic literature, just as they are in the New Testament. And they are spread broadly across a variety of genres, writers, and contexts. I want to argue that, quote, the tragic, which has long eluded hard and false and fast definitions, loomed larger in early Christian imagination than has heretofore been recognized, and was not dependent for this purely on reminiscences of Greco-Roman tragedy. So there's an ambivalence of early Christian writers to Greco-Roman, lack of a better term, pagan theater and drama. Talk a little bit about that. What ambivalences did these early Christian writers have to the theater?
Yeah. I spent a whole chapter talking about, the Christian interaction with the whole culture of the theater, particularly in the Roman imperial period. That there are a number of things in play there. One of them is an early tradition going certainly back to Tertullian's treatise on the shows, the De Spectaculis, and other pre-Nicene Christian polemical texts that are creating a sort of anti-theatrical tradition, mainly on the basis of this sort of skewering and caricaturing of the theater as a place of falsity, generally the creation of faux reality,
Mhm.
pseudo reality. And of course, Tertullian. The interesting thing when you read his treatise on the shows is that he knows full well, as a cultured Roman, he knows full well the power of theater. He knows its seductive influence, how it can just seize the emotions, work people over,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
for him, that is a dangerous sort of intoxication of the Christian that takes them away from the sobriety of their own faith,
Mhm.
puts them in dangerous positions, and of course, therefore, he's got this sort of blanket condemnation. He can find nothing really redeeming, at least explicitly redeeming, about the theater. And what's interesting too is, of course, much later, Augustine in the Confessions talks about his friend Alypius, who went to the theater as a law student. He was dragged to the theater against his will by some other students, and he gets in there. He knows he shouldn't be there, but he gets in there and he just gets taken over by the spectacle and the aura of it
Mhm.
all. And of course, Augustine, confesses his own addiction to the tragedies that he would go watch at the theater, when he was a young man in Carthage and so on. So there's this sense, this polemical tradition, which both absolutely chastises the theater of the culture of the theater and the sleaziness connected with it, and also tries to point out, that the philosophical tradition itself has a long-standing critique of the poets and of theatrics in general, So you got that, but there's also this underlying sense that it is powerful. The theatrical mimesis is powerful, which is why Tertullian has to throw in toward the end of the treatise that Christianity has its own great spectacle. The Bible itself presents us with a much more compelling spectacle. And other apologists and writers kind of use that same topos.
Mhm.
But it's a two-edged sword, and I think what makes and bring Plato and Aristotle into the mix. That's what I think is so interesting, is that even though they're not normally citing Plato and Aristotle against each other, or making uh, highly developed assessments of how the philosophical traditions have dealt with drama. Nevertheless, there's this underlying knowledge, especially among certain writers. I mean,
Mhm.
you think about Clement of Alexandria, who very much knows the poetic and dramatic traditions of the Greeks and can quote things, um, and then later on the Cappadocians and like Gregory Nazianzus and others who really know the tradition well,
Mhm.
and um, there seems to be at least some knowledge that Plato's critique of tragedy, critique of the theater, has been helpful to Christian critique of the theater. On the other hand, they know full well that at the end of the day, Plato has to concede that the poets are powerful.
Mhm.
They do something really compelling. Enough so that in the Republic, he finally comes out and says, "We philosophers really convey a much more powerful understanding of tragedy than the poets." He's got to make a kind of comeback. But then you've got Aristotle, in his sort of rehabilitation of the poets and the dramatists,
Mhm.
the tragedians, and so on, who, even though he certainly understands Plato's critique, he's so differently disposed about the rhetorical, dramatic, emotional power of theater. In the poetics, he really has very carefully studies its effect on audiences, and I think Aristotle has that one place in the Poetics where he really criticizes the daylights out of spectacle as such, because theater shouldn't just be about spectacle. It shouldn't be just about really graphic stuff. The most powerful theater is that which he calls, what's his phrase? Can't remember what the exact phrase is, but it's, that it's close to reality, that it's realistic, that it's not too far from the experience of people. I think the term he uses is probability, the probability of plots and so on, plots that are compelling and that have then the power to move the soul and have, as he famously says, the power of catharsis, the power to cleanse.
Isn't that one of his interpretive principles in his De Poetica? He discusses probability.
Absolutely.
Something to that effect, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you didn't discuss in the book, you see this tension even in the New Testament. Ash Wednesday started just this last Wednesday, and our reading was from Matthew, and it's Jesus telling his disciples not to pray like the hypocrites do on the street corners. And he calls them hypocrites, which the Greek term is the term used for actors on the stage. And you had mentioned something about a phoniness that was part of the critique of Christianity. Wasn't that also part of the philosophical critique too? Wasn't Plato kind of worried that they're just phony representations of what's real?
I think for Plato, for that tradition, it's just sort of cheap. Well, I think Plato's term is that it's emotional abuse. It takes over people and does things to them and enchants and seduces them and so on. But again, Plato's too smart a guy, to totally trash it. I mean, he wants to create this sort of false wedge between mythos and logos, when he knows full well that both are significant and both are philosophically significant. And so that's the beauty. The point I try to point out in the book is that there's a kind of dialectic in place as far as philosophical and even theological attitudes toward the theater, a dialectic in place that early Christianity in some respects builds on. But the difference, the gap there is early Christian writers aren't taking all their cues from Plato or Aristotle or anybody else, because at least some of them seem to see that the biblical writers themselves are brilliant dramatists. They're not going to, obviously they're not interested in suggesting that that these people are trying to do the same kind of work that ancient dramatists were doing. But the fact of the matter is that so much of biblical narrative and the tragic narratives in Scripture are so powerful, so compelling. They raise uncomfortable questions that are lingering in the background all the time, about divine providence and so on.
You've unpacked something that I've made a note even in the margins on page 36 that I wanted to unpack here.
I got to remember what I said.
What's that?
I got to remember what I said.
Well, this has to do with the dialectic between logos, reason, and mythos, myth or story. And here you talk about some of the Christian writers. All the while, so quote, all the while, Clement in Origen, the Cappadocians, Augustine, Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, John Scotus Erugena, and other late ancient and early medieval biblical interpreters, partially in response to Platonism and Stoicism, but also protective of basic cosmological claims of the Christian faith, affirmed that metaphysical reality transcendentally originated in the divine mind, logos, or wisdom as perfect archetypal principles, capacities, ideas, concepts, or starting points. This is These refer to the metaphysical reality of all things
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
clue humanity to God's imminent plan in creation and history. However, you then go on to say, well, this metaphysical reality embodied itself in the very fabric of intelligible and sensible creation. So this is the world of philosophers now.
Mhm.
It inscribed itself in scripture not as an isolatable body of philosophical insights, but as the divine wisdom embedded and imploded within the drama of revelation, within the thickness of the plot of tripersonal divine intervention in the world, end quote. So on the one hand, you have these very philosophically erudite thinkers in Christianity, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, the Cappadocians, Augustine.
Yeah.
They all hold these metaphysical realities to be true, these divine principles, logos. And yet they understand that it's made intelligible not through syllogisms in the philosophical sense, but through stories as they unfold in scripture. And you go on to talk about several pericopes in the biblical text.
Mhm.
Before we get to those individual ones, I think that is such an important it's an important point to make, because I think it clues them into the fact that human beings, the human mind itself, has limitations in how it can penetrate into these metaphysical realities, that we need storytelling, good storytelling.
Yeah. True, very true. And of course, anyone who's preached, I've done it many times myself in the church, and anyone who's preached knows that one of the great challenges of preaching is to be able to convey metaphysical claims, in a way that is narratively compelling. But the thing is, and what these writers understood was they're interested not in the mimesis of the Greco-Roman tragedians. They're interested in the biblical tragedians. They're interested in the way biblical writers are conveying higher truth within, pretty openly tragic narratives.
Yes.
Not that
That
every
is-
narrative in the scriptures is, but I've kind of pointed out some of the case studies.
That is okay. So tragic. Human life is tragic.
Yeah.
And that's something I get from one of my very favorite contemporary philosophers, Thomas Sowell, who contrasts these two visions: the unconstrained vision of people who think that human beings, freedom and intellect alone, can achieve such great things. We can do everything through that, versus what he calls the constrained vision, or he also calls it the tragic vision. Human beings have limitations, and we need institutions to help form us. This tragic vision, this biblical vision of the world, of the human condition, begins with the Genesis account, but primarily in the Garden of Eden. And that's one of these pericopes that you unpack in this book. Talk a little bit about that, the fall, the great fall. What is that story conveying here?
Yeah. Well, of course, that, and obviously early Christian exegetes recognized this. One of the key elements in classical tragedy was peripeteia, the fall of the so-called hero figure. We have that strange term hamartia, that often in contemporary English has been translated, probably in a sloppy way, the tragic flaw. But in many respects, it's better translated and more faithfully translated to the tragic tradition as a horrible miscalculation. And of course, we all know that hamartia is also the New Testament term for sin most of the time. So it's this interesting complexity of that narrative. I mean, the narrative's already full of philosophical and theological problems, that, like, the one that comes up, often not so explicitly, often implicitly, is what, if God creates these beings in this original paradise, and even in a state of original righteousness, if they're enjoying a state of virtual perfection, then how could they possibly have fallen away if they weren't already at some level, and intrinsically flawed, which of course created all kinds of
Yes.
issues regarding theodicy and so on. Does that not reflect on the creator and so on? There are all those kind of things hanging around in the background, But at the end of the day, the question turns on the fall itself, the character of the vice, and there's elements in the story that sound very tragic. They're caught, suddenly. As the text says, their eyes are opened. The revelation of their horrific miscalculation is upon them, and you have that moment, in a sense, of chaos is returning, chaos is resurgent. Granted, the narrative in Genesis 3 moves pretty quickly then on to God's trying to redeem the situation, which is what the rest of the Bible is about.
Yes, that's right.
But there's that. I think that's where a lot of writers saw the most tragic dimension, the nature of the fall itself, what's going on there existentially. And of course, you have that whole tradition of speculation in Greek and Latin patristic writers and commentators on what was the original vice, that created the fall. Was it pride? Was it envy, as Gregory of Nyssa says, the Adam and Eve imitating the envy of the devil? And there's a number of things that are, Maximus says it's self-love. It's kind of this baseline narcissism that kind of kicks in. There's all this speculation, but at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't make any difference. It happened.
Yes.
And it's an apocalypse, and it
reflects
sets
reality.
in motion. It sets in motion a whole new plot, right? So it's a plot that's not going to get less complex. It's going to get more complex, as it does with Cain and Abel.
Yes, that's another story that you talk about.
Oh yeah. And Cain is a marvelous case study of a tragic figure in Scripture.
Yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this stuff hasn't been lost on a lot of biblical critical scholars who've, they recognize these things too, and that there's all sorts of literary dimensions to the biblical text itself. So we've got pretty good studies on tragedy in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. So
one story I'm glad you talked about here, because it's something I'm working on for the Canadian Patristic Society conference coming up in May, and that's this interesting story about Jacob and Esau. Why was God so mean to Esau? He didn't do anything wrong. That this is another drama that unfolds, which is kind of depicting something that's going on within this drama of salvation that can't quite be syllogized in a way. It's revealing something through a myth and a story. Talk a little bit about that pericope, because the surface level reading is, God is unfair. Esau didn't do anything wrong. Jacob is the swindler here.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, one of the problems in early Christian exegesis of that story was that it got loaded up early on with typologies, especially since Paul himself in Romans 9 talks about Jacob and Esau. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, that famous text that's requoted in Romans 9. And the ways in which then Jacob becomes the heroic type or figure of God's people, Israel, um, and and then later, of course, the church.
Hmm.
And Esau becomes the outsider, and ironically, then becomes really the rejected people.
Hmm.
And so there's all of that gets loaded up, but you have within patristic commentary on that text, they do take a second look. They're taken back as well by what we see.
Hmm.
Jacob is a jackass
Yes, yes.
who deserves to get his ass kicked.
Yeah.
If that's not an overloading of the description. But and Esau is just sort of this, well, to some degree, a bungler. I mean,
Mhm.
and they pointed out the irony of he gives up his birthright over a bowl of beans. You know, but he does come across that's the great question: who's the real tragic figure here?
Mhm.
And in a sense, they both are. You know, because Jacob is somebody who's himself a deviant figure. He's a victim of himself in many respects, and God has to take him to task, at the river Jabbok to kind of turn him around and get him, on the right track. Whereas Esau, different kind of tragic character in the sense of he just doesn't know what the heck's going on,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And you know and that there's so much comedy in it. That's what a lot of scholars point out, is there's a
Yeah.
lot of comedy. And I think that early Christian commentators recognize this as well. There's a lot of comedy in the text, because not only is Jacob pulling it all off, but he does it as the one who's this mama's boy. you know
Yep. Yep.
he's a mama's boy. She's the one that's going to be all on board with his ruse.
Mhm.
And so and there's poor old Isaac, who's just kind of clueless, in the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's just a horrible tragedy of sibling rivalry, that's gone completely foul. Granted that the story has a kind of happy ending, which is why some scholars have said that the story of Jacob and Esau is really more a comedy than a tragedy on Aristotelian terms, because it has a happy ending
Mhm.
that Jacob and Esau
Yeah.
are
True.
reconciled.
Yep.
But man, the details of the whole thing, it has obvious tragic elements, as do other sibling rivalries, like Cain and Abel, and others. And of course, Greek tragedy loved sibling rivalries. And so there are all these echoes all the time, parallels with the Greco-Roman tradition and so on.
I would like to see what Genesis Rabbah has to say about this story, because the story
Good
is
question.
is
Yeah.
understood within the Jewish tradition as the election of the people of Israel,
Hmm.
which gets me to think how they understood themselves in relation to God. Because, as you say, Jacob he's an ass, and if
Yeah.
he's representative of the people of Israel, and they're aligning themselves with him, what does that say about their understanding of their? Because as the Bible unfolds, I mean, it's full of Israel doing really stupid things,
Yeah.
and God trying to fix the situation. I wonder what the Jewish interpreters, or maybe the Talmud or something, has to say about this story. I'd like to look into that a little bit
And
more.
overall, there's a strong tragic element there, because what you have particularly in the Hebrew Bible, but really throughout Scripture, is that sense that creation as a whole, but even God's people, are always on the verge of chaos.
Yes, yes.
Falling back into chaos, or as Athanasius likes to say, falling back into nothingness.
Which is a great hermeneutic for kind of depicting the drama of salvation. We're always on the verge of just falling right over and
Exactly.
being completely irredeemable.
Exactly.
Now Augustine will take the story and say, well, look, this is just a story of God's his meriting out grace according to his own will. I can't explain it. Shut up and deal with it.
Yeah.
Origen does something quite unique, and he says, when this can't depict God's injustice, so Jacob must have merited something before their embodiment.
Yeah.
So this is where
Right.
he develops his theory of the pre-existence of the soul. So there were philosophical problems attached to this story
Exactly.
quite as well. But it is really a great drama, or you call it a tragedy or a comedy, for kind of grappling with the human condition and humanity's relationship with
It's
God.
interesting too, both Luther and Calvin did substantial commentary on particularly the text about Jacob wrestling with God. And I think it was one of those texts, kind of like the attempted sacrifice, Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac, that
Yes.
people just couldn't get away from it. It was
Mhm.
almost addictive, you know.
Jephthah, as you talk
Yeah.
about in here.
Oh, Jephthah. The Jephthah story, you read it, so if you just read it and don't know anything about the background of it, it's outrageous. I mean, it is pure. It's maybe the purest tragedy in the entire Bible, because it's a dead end.
He kills
You
his
know?
daughter.
Yeah, I mean, she's sacrificed. Uh, the virgins go out and mourn her. Her life's cut off. He gets by with it. This is the guy who was upon whom the Spirit of the Lord had landed.
Yeah.
It's just breathtaking in the scope of it. And of course, really, then Jephthah is the tragic figure
Mhm.
more than the daughter, because he has made a unbelievable miscalculation.
Mhm.
You know,
Yep.
and basically ruined himself and his future on this miscalculation. So but yeah, I used a lot in analyzing the early Christian views of that story. John Thompson's wonderful book called "Righting the Wrongs," which is about interpretation of stories of women in the Bible, and he has a wonderful extended treatment of how the Jephthah story came down in later interpretation.
Yeah, the Jephthah story in particular makes one sympathize with Marcion, who he wanted to reject the Old Testament completely. That's not a God worthy of our worship.
Yeah, exactly.
And another one which is really terrible, but we celebrate it every year, the slaughter of the holy innocents. Now that's not Old Testament, that's New Testament. That's another one that is perplexing to the reader. But all of these stories in the text and in the writings of these early Christians, as you say, serve a purpose. They're trying to do something. They're trying to cultivate a conscience, as you get into in a later chapter. Talk a little bit about that. What do they do? What do these writers do with these stories? And how are they trying to convey them to an audience? What are they trying to do?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a number of things going on. I mean, at one level, theodicy is going on. I mean, they're still maneuvering to find ways to help God save face, and trying to bring out, the latent positive meanings in stories like the Jephthah tale. I mean, the sad thing is, you have early Christian commentators who do anything and everything to try to rescue Jephthah, in order basically to rescue God,
Mhm.
whose spirit had landed on the shoulder of
Yeah,
Jephthah.
yeah.
And you get some really, really screwy kinds of, I hate to say it, but I mean really screwy kinds of interpretation. As brilliant as Jacob of Sarug in the Syriac tradition, the preacher Jacob of Sarug, brilliant as he was, and he was his phenomenal preacher and commentator. But on the Jephthah thing, he was one of the ones that said, well, Jephthah was very intentionally trying to be a prototype, of God sacrificing his own son. Really? you know, I got to take a deep breath on that one.
That's
you know.
stretching the imagination a little bit.
Yeah, but so again, theodicy, justification, the ways of God, that's going on in some cases, but there are other writers and preachers who I think want to take you to the edge. They want to push you as far as they can to imagine a world in which there's no divine providence, in which we are truly at the mercies of fate, and that's interesting in itself, because you have a whole philosophical tradition of speculation about the nature of fate. You even have traditions that are helping fate to be reinterpreted as a lesser form of divine providence. So it very, very interesting there. But I can't remember where I was going with that. But anyway, I think there's a desire on the part of some of the exegetes to just push the Christian imagination to the edge and then pull back, because at the end of the day, the doctrine of divine providence is kind of a non-negotiable. It's an article of the faith.
It is. That's right.
So you really can't push too far. But I'm convinced that, as the next to the last chapter of the book, I think it is, I talk about early Christian commentators flirting with fate in a beautifully rhetorical way, kind of again, helping their audiences imagine a world where there's no providence, where we're just, pawns, where we are just screwing ourselves up ad nauseum, where there's no hope, where everything's really a dead end, So I think there's also, by the way, in the book, I mentioned a number of times the writer George Steiner, the literary critic, who years ago argued that Christianity was so intrinsically non-tragic. Christianity puts way too much emphasis on eschatological hope and on a good ending of the cosmic story, ever to be able to accommodate tragedy. And I think Steiner, of course, Steiner didn't read, all these early Christian sources in detail and so forth. And I understand I get his point, but I think he's dead wrong.
Absolutely.
I think what is interesting is the way early Christian authors seem to skirt around describing the fate of Jesus in explicitly tragic terms, simply because the so-called tragic heroes of the ancient tradition were often such sketchy characters and so morally compromised, but there's still a tragic element there. There's tragedy in the Father abandoning the Son to crucifixion, in the passivity of Christ to the circumstances that he ends up in, yeah. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
You are, and you're getting to another, maybe my favorite chapter, maybe, tragical pathos. So these tragedies evoke emotional responses. They also evoke philosophical problems. I mean, you have Jesus's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Didymus the Blind, for example, in his commentary on the Psalms, gets into questions about whether or not Jesus was a coward. Was he not? If a passion is a disordered affection of the soul that kind of exceeds the bounds of reason, was Jesus not a sinner? And of course, this is where he kind of gets into this pre-passion, this
propathia.
And in this chapter, you talk a bit about how drama really helped these early Christian writers to distinguish different kinds of emotional reactions. And you say it helps to create an ordered kind of emotional response,
Mhm.
as opposed to like a disordered emotional
Yeah,
response. Can you say a
yeah,
little bit about that? I think that's a very important point of how dramas and tragedies function.
yeah, yeah. And that's where I think they erred on the side of Aristotle
Yes.
in the sense of realizing that drama can affect emotions in constructive ways. You know, that of course, what Aristotle does is focus so much attention on fear and pity as the two most powerful emotions evoked by tragedy, which need to be cleansed. You know, the catharsis notion. And man, there's a whole tradition of interpreting what that really means. You know, particularly what it means for Aristotle himself. You know, you got these different theories that it's really about kind of ventilating emotions that can just overwhelm you. You know, one school of thinking is that it's really a more an education of the emotions that that theater can help us to have practice runs with our emotions so that we can deal with them constructively in real life situations, those kinds of things.
Hmm.
And and I think even though patristic authors, are, generally speaking, are not terribly interested in what Aristotle's precise view of catharsis was, they certainly did believe that emotions needed, not only did they need to be cleansed in the sense of purified and and redirected and reoriented and so forth, but they played a decisive role in the virtuous life. You know, that they play a decisive role in launching the soul toward godliness. You know, and that there's this whole group of emotions that play into the cultivation of Christian character.
Hmm.
You know, now that the thing that's interesting though is, you know, they recognized certainly that fear and pity were the two great tragic emotions that had been played up in the Greco-Roman tragic tradition. But what they do with those then is sort of try to reinterpret them on, you know, profoundly Christian terms. You know, that fear that the fear that Aristotle talks about in response to tragedy is what, you know, it's where the person sitting in the audience sees this person suffering on stage, and that person reminds them of themselves, and the suffering is a little too close for comfort. You know, in which case they have to feel that pain in order to sort of comfort themselves and cleanse themselves of the passion. Whereas, you know, the fear evoked by Christian tragedy, or the, you know, the mimesis of tragedy in the Christian tradition would be more along the lines of not fearing so much for oneself, but focusing one's fear on the God who is to be feared,
Hmm.
the God who is able to create um, hope out of chaos and so
So
on.
there's
Or
an educational dimension here where they're
yeah,
trying to
exactly.
form.
Or in the case of grief or pity, excuse me, pity, with pity, you know, there that's an interesting case study because the actual emotion of pity was in so much of particularly Stoic philosophy, a kind of throwaway emotion. You know,
Mhm.
it's just it's kind of useless, you know, unless, you know, your mercy or pity for someone becomes such that you're trying to do something to help them improve their moral character or something along those lines, helping them to live a more philosophical life. But just pity is kind of a waste, you know, and yet Christian mercy takes over, you know. And this is, I think, what's compelling with Augustine in the Confessions, where he admits at the beginning of book 3 that he was going to the theater in Carthage as a young man. He was sitting there in the audience of the tragedies, crying his eyes out, and feeling so sorry, feeling this deep, tragic pity for these characters on the stage. But he turns around and he said, why was I wasting that emotional energy on false reality when my pity, my mercy should have been turned on those who really need it, including the person who's reveling in their own sin, and of course that the whole Christian sort of recreation, in a sense, of the notion of mercy is quite a sight to behold. The other thing is, of course, what these writers are doing is suggesting that the real tragic emotions are a much bigger list than fear and pity. One of the most powerful is grief.
Mhm.
Yep. And fear and grief were always considered to be, probably the two most potent emotions. Fear feeds on itself. Fear, like FDR said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, meaning that fear just feeds off itself, and we fear to the point where we fear the fear. Pity has the prospect like fear of being completely reoriented. Grief is like fear in the sense of it is just such an oppressive emotion. You watch somebody who's bereaved. I have a good friend that just lost his wife, and to watch him, struggling with this feeling of emotional amputation, in which case grief has to be reinvented. Grief has to be redirected. Grief has to be reoriented. And we see this whole, what I like to call this whole gamut of emotions connected with grief, many of which are going to be very important, constructive emotions in the making of the Christian, and in their ability to live in a world that is full of tragedies,
Yeah, and you talk, pity is a big part of this book, and you say, like in the Stoic tradition, for example, there can be a narcissistic element to it where it just becomes acedia, and then you're just kind of wallowing in your own narcissism. But there's a delicate balance there, because Christians are called to have mercy on others. So mythos and logos kind of converge to educate Christians on how to properly order such an emotion in response to things. I thought that was a pretty vital point of your book, and I think it is something that even today, good storytelling accomplishes this. Of course, we live in a world where in our pop culture we have it's just the opposite, where it's not properly ordering our emotions. It's self-indulgence and complete abject narcissism and disgust. But that was also part of the early Christian world, because you talk about how the theater kind of just became about simple debauchery. I was wondering, gone on for about an hour here. I wonder if you could take us home a little bit here, because in your last chapter, you almost take your historian hat off and you get into more contemporary or modern issues. And 20th century Catholic theologian, you really talk about at length here, Hans Urs von Balthasar. What's going on there? And talk a little bit about that, because that was pretty important for your kind of the inspiration for you writing this book.
Yeah. Well, I'd already read a little bit into the contemporary theological debates on tragedy in modern Christian writing, which kind of fed me while I was writing this book, because it kind of kept an interesting conversation going on in my own brain between ancient and modern sources. What I found was, and I talk about this a little bit in that chapter, what I found was there's a pretty strong difference of opinion among some contemporary theologians over the utility of tragedy as a medium, even as a mimetic medium for Christian theology. Like one of the people I mentioned is David Bentley Hart,
Yes.
who's very, very hot in contemporary theology.
Universal salvation.
Well, he's written on a lot of different things, and he's hang on a second, my dog.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all.
What happens when you have a dog, right?
Well, dogs should rule the world, absolutely.
But as I was saying about David Bentley Hart, he's got no use for tragedy as a mode of Christian theology. Same thing with John Milbank. Both of them have stated quite clearly that they think it's at the end of the day, it's kind of a glorious waste of time. But then you have a whole cadre of other folks who take a very different view. What's his name? Ben. This is bad. I haven't been back to my book for a while. Let me pull up their names. Paul Jantz and where are you? Paul Jantz and Ben Quash. Jantz and Quash are both contemporary British theologians, and then even before them, the Scottish philosopher theologian. This is terrible. Donald McKinnon, who Rowan Williams greatly admired, and who kind of got Rowan Williams interested in the theology of the tragic. And because McKinnon was very much of the mind that the tragic mimetic mode is very vital to Christian theology. And so Rowan Williams then has picked this up. He's got a wonderful little book on the tragic dimension in Christianity. It's a very short book. I think it's based on some lectures that he did. But there's this very interesting conversation that's been going on, is it as David Bentley Hart said, a kind of glorious red herring, or is it something along the lines of what McKinnon and Rowan Williams and Ben Quash and Paul Jantz call a vital part of Christian thinking about the world? And I think they win. The latter group wins simply because Christians have always needed to be sobered to the reality of real inexplicable evil in the world and situations that just do not seem to be redeemable.
Yeah.
As Rowan Williams says, there's the reality that there's no moral calculus in the world, that you're not at the end. There is no perfect law of retribution operative in the cosmos, which even the skeptics in the Old Testament realized, and that we all are going to be pushed to the edge, unless we're going to live in complete immunity from suffering, which is highly doubtful. But we're going to be pushed. A lot of people are going to be pushed to the very precipice of falling away from any kind of hope for the future, and von Balthasar then played heavily into my thinking, of course, also because he's the first person to really recognize that there was a vital tragic dimension in early Christian theology. Often he goes through it a little bit historically in his own work and sees it as a developmental stage kind of in early Christian thinking. I'm not totally satisfied with where he ends up with his historical analysis, but at least he showed that very early on, the habitus of Christian theology was tolerant of a mimesis of tragedy because of the recognition that the Bible itself realizes tragedy. I mean, it knows it, it engages with it, implicitly and sometimes explicitly. So all that's to say that this contemporary debate stirred my imagination and helped me form questions and go back to the sources of early Christian writers and think things through again with them. And of course, a lot of my favorite work is work that is retrieval work or ressourcement, where you're bringing ancient and modern perspectives into conversation with each other.
Yes.
So, what was your original question? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I kind of lost what the original.
No, I think you answered it. It evokes a question from me because you bring up David Bentley Hart. And I don't know if he says much about this very popular topic in scholarship today, also very popular among some of the writers you deal with in your book, and that's deification, which would seem to present a very non-tragic view of the human person, a very positive and optimistic view, where through training in virtue and contemplation, the human person can conform him or herself to God and become God in a way, a lowercase g. And yet at the same time, among these very writers, there's a dramatic realism that human life, that it's that kind of deification. I don't know how to put it. It seems like there'd be a fundamental incompatibility there, but I'm not sure that there is. But I don't know, because it would seem as if these writers who talk about deification would fall into soul's category of the unconstrained vision, where we are limitless with our potential. Yet they never go that far. Even the ones who talk about deification, there's something preventing us from achieving that. I don't know what your thoughts are. You don't talk about it in your book, but it seems like something worth pursuing. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't go into deification a lot. I talk in the very end of the book, the epilogue of the book, I talk about hope as a tragic emotion.
Yes.
But I think anyone who let me take Gregory of Nyssa as an example, because we know that Gregory affirmed what I like to call a qualified universalism, a notion of apokatastasis, which in some ways was compatible with Origen's. I think that's been proven sufficiently that Gregory was a particular kind of universalist in that sense, and who understood deification as this sort of final process of purgation, which is really never final because we're always being renewed and remade in virtue from ages unto ages unto ages. That deification is really this, in some respects, an ongoing education of the soul's desires, and an unimaginable enjoyment of all the infinite divine goods and so forth. But this is the same guy who, in his first treatise on virginity, talks about, in very graphic terms, about the tragedy of marriage and child rearing, and how people get locked into it. And of course he's very careful not to be trashing marriage. He doesn't want to go there, obviously. And he himself, we believe, was married, but he paints it in overtly I mean, he uses tragic language to describe it. That the couple gets married, they're on this seemingly endless honeymoon, and then all of a sudden reality kicks in. And then, they start having kids, and the kids go wrong, or the kid or the mother dies in childbirth. It's just one damn thing after another,
Mhm.
kind of.
Mhm.
It paints this really rather wretched view. And Gregory of Nazianzus does the same thing. They obviously were feeding off each other a little bit. Um, all in an attempt, I think, to say that this life is not the eschaton.
Mhm.
As good as creation intrinsically is, we still live in a compromised, stunted state of existence. And in his homilies on Ecclesiastes, he can be very foreboding. I mean, how can you not be when you're reading Koheleth? You're reading this incredibly skeptical text. It's not. I mean, there are the moments when you feel like Gregory is just right there with Koheleth. You look around. What's happening? The same damn thing over
Yeah.
and over and over again. Life is just a sort of ebb and flow. It's a cycle, the same thing, the drudgery of existence. It's he paints all that, and it's out of that. That's the refiner's fire. That's the beginning of the refiner's fire in this process of deification. And of course Gregory he's kind of like Irenaeus in the sense that Irenaeus doesn't want to openly say, that humanity needed to sin in order for all of God's grace to be shown, the Felix culpa idea. He doesn't want to kind of come right out and say it, but there's a sense in it's true, in which God is always seizing the new creation from the jaws of chaos.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
That's a sort of deeply biblical motif that ties together protology and eschatology, ties together the beginning and the end.
at the Easter Vigil, we started with the Exultet and, oh, happy fault of Adam. I mean, it's there.
It is.
How do we make sense of that? I mean, that's, maybe that's what the tragedies can help us figure out that simple philosophical speculation can't.
Yeah.
Well, there's navigate that terrain.
We have to always remember there's a little Kierkegaard in the fathers. There's a little bit of that sense. You got to deal with existence, man. You can't just, you can't fall totally in despair, and you can't aim at a ridiculously hopeful hope.
Yes.
We live kind of in between those, and we got to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really kind of what the Bible's about anyway.
Yes.
The Bible's dealing with the crisis. Most of the Bible's dealing with the crisis. It's not speculating exactly how this all had to happen in the first place, and it's not constantly revisiting this issue of why do these creatures, set in this magnificent paradise, manage to screw things up unless they're antecedently flawed, So.
What a great way to end a great conversation. Dr. Paul Blowers, thank you very much for discussing your book, Visions and Faces of the Tragic, the mimesis of tragedy and the folly of salvation in early Christian literature.
And by the way, definitely look at the cover of the book. Okay.
Oh, do you want to say a word about that before we?
Yeah. This is Carpaccio's famous painting, which sometimes it's called the Dead Christ. I think here they mention it as the grave preparation of Christ. But this was painted by Carpaccio in the beginning of the 16th century, and it is absolutely magnificent portrait of the seeming despair and hopelessness following the crucifixion. Where Christ is dying, is lying there lifeless, and you have all these people mourning around him. And the figure in the middle leaning against the tree, most interpreters think that's supposed to be Job. And you can kind of see up on the hill at the upper left, you can kind of see the three crosses up there, and you can see the people doing the tomb preparation down there, Joseph of Arimathea and so on. But the faces and the specter of hopelessness there around the most hopeful event of all, it's a magnificent piece. I was glad I got to use it. In fact, Ben Quash has an absolutely wonderful essay in one of his books on that painting. But it's just a powerful piece, and it kind of conveyed in an iconic way what I couldn't convey in words.
Well, I'm actually glad we got to talk about that, because in 24 episodes now, this is the first time we've got to talk about the cover art.
Oh, good.
Is an often overlooked dimension of a book.
Yeah.
They say don't judge a book by its cover, but I don't know.
Sometimes you should, right?
Sometimes you should, absolutely. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Blowers, thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
Yep. Take care.
All right.